It was a moment that could have changed history, a single decision that still echoed through the corridors of American power. On January 20th, 1949, as the new President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, stood on the steps of the Capitol to take the oath of office for his first full term, one man was conspicuously absent. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who had led the Allied forces to victory in World War II, had chosen not to attend Truman's inauguration. But it wasn't just an absence. It was a statement, a cold rejection of the very man who had once been a trusted friend and ally. It was a snub that spoke volumes about the tension between the two men and the fractured political landscape of post-war America. The question that loomed large was why. Eisenhower's refusal to attend Truman's inauguration came on the heels of a growing rift between the two men. The war hero, celebrated by millions for his leadership in Europe, had become increasingly disillusioned with Truman's leadership. As the 1948 election approached, Eisenhower had been strongly courted by both the Republican and Democratic parties to run for president. Many assumed that Eisenhower, the most popular man in America at the time, would easily step into the political spotlight, perhaps even as Truman's successor. Yet, Eisenhower refused. He remained in Europe, focused on his role as the president of Columbia University. But even then, the tension between the two was undeniable. It all began to unravel when Truman, who had inherited the presidency after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in 1945, began to shift the direction of American foreign policy. With the war over, Truman was faced with the immense task of navigating the Cold War, dealing with the rising threat of Soviet expansion, and attempting to rebuild Europe. He was no longer the wartime leader who had made crucial decisions with Eisenhower at his side. Now Truman was a man grappling with the intricacies of diplomacy, economics, and a divided nation. Eisenhower, who had worked so closely with Roosevelt and had taken pride in his role during the war, found himself increasingly frustrated with Truman's decisions. It wasn't just the policies that divided them, though. It was the personal rift that had begun to widen. Eisenhower had felt slighted by Truman's public remarks regarding his military leadership. Truman had criticized Eisenhower's decisions in Europe, questioning his strategies and even his competence at times. Eisenhower, who had held his loyalty to his commander-in-chief above all else during the war, now found himself on the receiving end of harsh criticism from the very man he had once served under. The man who had once been a mentor had become a source of deep frustration. As Eisenhower weighed his options, he was increasingly drawn toward the Republican Party as the best vehicle for his vision of America's future. He had been offered the opportunity to run in 1948, but he declined, choosing to remain neutral in the political turmoil. It was clear, however, that Eisenhower's relationship with Truman was rapidly deteriorating. The two men, once allies on the world stage, were now at odds on the domestic front. Their political and personal differences had grown to the point where Eisenhower felt that to attend Truman's inauguration would be to endorse a man whom he no longer trusted. And Truman himself? He was in an impossible position. There he was, acutely conscious of Eisenhower's towering figure, both in military and political circles. Yet, under these conditions, it was almost impossible that any rapprochement could be effected between the two men. Truman had to deal with the realities of his presidency, and Eisenhower's absence at the inauguration highlighted the fracture between them. But what could have been done? Would the wounds have healed with a handshake between the two men? Would such a gesture have looked like some sort of grand reconciliation in front of the public? The questions loomed, but the answer was already clear. The damage had been done. As the inauguration ceremony unfolded without Eisenhower by Truman's side, the weight of the moment hung in the air. America moved into a new chapter marked by the Cold War and the struggle for global dominance. Truman stood on the steps, his hand raised to swear the oath of office, but the absence of Eisenhower, the man who had led the Allies to victory, was felt deeply. The American people knew that something had shifted. The uneasy tension between the two men was no longer just a matter of policy differences, it had become personal. And as the camera panned over the ceremony, Eisenhower's absence became a stark reminder of the fractures that were beginning to appear in the fabric of American leadership. Despite the tension, Eisenhower's refusal to attend the inauguration would only cement his reputation as a man of principle. He would go on to become the 34th President of the United States in 1953. But that decision to stay away from Truman's ceremony would be a defining moment in his political journey. It was a moment that showed he would not compromise his beliefs, even to the extent of immense pressure. And while Truman's presidency was marked by difficult decisions and a war-torn world, Eisenhower's rise to power would signal a shift toward a new era of American politics, one in which compromise would become harder to come by, and the lines between personal and political would become increasingly blurred. Looking back, the incident of January 20th, 1949, stands at a pivotal moment in American history. It was a turning point in the relationship between two of the most powerful men of the 20th century. Their rift, which had started over policy disagreements, had grown into a public display of animosity. The absence of Dwight D. Eisenhower from Truman's inauguration was a visual representation of the deepening divide in American politics. But it was also a signal that the political landscape was about to change. The eventual victory of Eisenhower in 1952 passed the torch from one generation to another and forever altered the nation.